The session. Let's bring ourselves into the session. Let's tense the whole body with double inhalation. Vibrate. Relax as we breathe out. Couple of times more. Inhale, bringing all the tension of the day, physical, mental, emotional, and letting them all go and relaxing completely. One last time. Closing our eyes, keeping our gaze at the point between the eyebrows. Let's pray together. Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, Friend, Beloved God, Great Masters of Kriya Yoga, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar Ji, our beloved Gurudev, Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, saints and sages of all religions, dear friend and guide, Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow at thy feet. O great ones, may we tune into thy consciousness, thy guidance, thy understanding of this path. Help us, guide us, be with us here today. Help us to feel that tangible presence with us as we dive deep into these teachings. We are thine, be thou eternally ours. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay. We'll do one chant, a very short meditation, and then we'll start. Let's pause here for a moment, closing our eyes, gazing up at the point between the eyebrows. Continue mentally chanting this chant. I am the bubble, make me the sea. Wave of the sea, dissolve in the sea. That is all where we all want to head towards. Self-realization, to become one with the ocean. and lose this individual identity, the ego. You're just bubbles in this vast sea. Let this be our constant prayer. Make me the sea, wave of the sea, dissolve in the sea. Nothing, no separateness, just one with the infinite. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So, last chapter we saw basic. He just told about his family history, and one thing that very clearly stood out, where he says that I came into this world, I believe, already fully myself. There he's giving us an indication that it is not a typical a childhood or an infant who was completely lost, very very helpless. So it was like he's giving us as an indication that I was fully myself. I was very much aware, kind of, that he was a soul or whatever, but it wasn't a normal baby, right? And as he says that his mother had, in fact, when she was carrying him at that time, she had given this baby to the Lord, which later on turned out to be a blessing for him. So with that, there's the next chapter where he tells us more details about himself, where he grew up. This is kind of it is not just he's talking about his childhood and how he was growing up. There was always something beyond a normal childhood that he's talking about. A lot of lessons in each of the pages. So first, let us listen to Swamiji reading this chapter, and then we will discuss this chapter.
Chapter 2. He sets out from home. Joy has always been my first love. I have longed to share it with others. My clearest early memories all relate to a special kind of happiness, one that seemed to have little to do with the things around me, that at best was only reflected in them. A lingering impression is one of wonder to be in this world at all. What was I doing here? Intuitively I felt there must be some higher reality, another world perhaps, radiant, beautiful, harmonious, in relation to which this earthly plane represented mere exile. Beautiful sounds and colors thrilled me almost to ecstasy. Sometimes I would cover a table down to the floor with a colorful American Indian blanket, then crawl inside and fairly drink in the luminous colors. At other times, gazing into the prism formed by the broad edge of a mirror on my mother's dressing table, I would imagine myself living in a world of rainbow-colored lights. Often, also at night, I would see myself absorbed in a radiant inner light, and my consciousness would expand beyond the limits of my body. You were eager for knowledge, Mother told me, not a little willful, but keenly sympathetic to the misfortunes of others. Smiling playfully, she added, I used to read children's books to you. If the hero was in trouble, I would point pityingly to his picture. When I did so, your lips quivered. Poor this, you exclaimed. Mother, naughty this, found my response so amusing that she sometimes played on it by pointing tragically to the cheerful pictures as well. A miserable ploy which, she informs me, invariably succeeded. As I grew older, my inner joy spilled over into an intense enthusiasm for life. Television gave us many opportunities to be creative in our play. We were far removed from the modern world of frequent movies, circuses, and other contrived amusements. Television was, of course, unknown at that time, even in America. As a community composed mostly of English and American families, we were remote even from the mainstream of Romanian culture. Our parents taught us a few standard Anglo-American games, but for the most part we invented our own. Our backyard became transformed into adventure lands. A long stepladder laid sideways on the snow became an airplane soaring us to warmer climes. A large apple tree with hanging branches served a variety of useful functions: a schoolhouse, a seagoing schooner, a castle. Furniture piled high in various ways in the nursery would become a Spanish galleon or a mountain fortress. We blazed secret trails through a nearby cornfield to a cache of buried treasure, or to a point of safety from the pursuing officers of some unspeakably wicked tyrant. In winter, skating on a tennis court that had been flooded to make an ice rink, we gazed below us into the frozen depths and imagined ourselves moving freely in another dimension of wonderful shapes and colors. I remember a ship, too, that I set out to build, fully intending to sail it on Lake Snagoff. I got as far as nailing a few old boards together in nondescript imitation of a deck. In imagination, however, as I lay in bed at night and contemplated the job, I was already sailing my schooner on the high seas. Leadership came naturally to me, though I was unwilling to exert it if others didn't spontaneously share my interests. The children in Teleagin did share them, and enthusiastically embraced my ideas. More and more, however, as I grew older, I discovered that many people considered my view of things somewhat peculiar. I noticed it first in some of the newly arrived children in Teleagin. Accustomed as they were to the standard childhood games of England and America, they would look puzzled at my proposals for more imaginative entertainment, like the time we gazed into unfamiliar dimensions in the ice while skating over it. Unwilling to impose my interests on them, I was equally unwilling to accept their imposition in return. I was, I suppose, eccentric, not from any conscious desire or intent, but from a certain inability to attune myself to others' norms. What was important to me seemed to them unimportant, whereas frequently what they considered important seemed to me incomprehensible. Miss Barbara Henson, later Mrs. Elsdale, our governess for a time, described me years later in a letter the way she remembered me as a child of 7. "You were certainly different, Don, in the family but not of it. I was always conscious that you had a mystic quality which set you apart, and others were aware of it too. You are always the observer, with an extraordinary straight look in those blue-gray eyes, which made you in a sense ageless. In a quiet, disconcerting way, you made funny little experiments on people, as if to satisfy your suspicions about something concerning them. Never to be put off by prevarication or half-truths, you were, one felt, seeking the truth behind everything. Mildred Perrott, the wife of our Anglican minister in Ploiești at the time, once told me, "I can go through a keyhole." "You can?" I exclaimed. From then on I kept pestering her to perform this miracle, until finally she relented. Writing the letter I on a small piece of paper, she folded it up and shoved it through a keyhole. I still remember my disappointment, for I wanted miracles to belong in the realm of the possible. Cora Brazier, our next-door neighbor, a kind, sympathetic Romanian lady, once remarked to Miss Henson, "I always try to be especially nice to Don, because he's not like the others. I believe he knows this and is lonely. Although this knowledge was not to dawn on me fully until after I left Deliagen, there was even then a certain sense of being alone. It was held in abeyance, however, by the presence of good friends and by a harmonious home life. My parents loved us children deeply. Their love for each other, too, was exemplary and a strong source of emotional security for us. Never in my life did I know them to quarrel or to have even the slightest falling out. My father was especially wonderful with children. Rather reserved by nature, he yet possessed a simple kindness and a sense of humor that enabled him to appreciate young minds. At bedtime, he would invent hilarious stories for us that were continued night after night, frequently with additions from his enthusiastic listeners. Then, as my brothers and I were ready to fall asleep, he would arrange us at one end of the bed or the other, depending on whether we said we wanted to travel in sleep to Australia, America, or to some other distant land. He taught us much, by example as well as words. Above all, what we learned from him came from observing in him a nature always humble, honest, truthful, honorable, kind, and scrupulously fair. I would go so far as to call him, in his quiet, rather reserved way, a great man. But in my own relationship with him, there was a certain sadness. I could not be to him the kind of mirror a man naturally hopes for in his sons, especially his firstborn. I tried earnestly to share his interests, but where he was attracted to the hows of things, I was attracted to the whys. He was a scientist, and I instinctively a mystic and philosopher. He tried to interest me in the way things worked. Parenthesis. I still remember one dusty expedition under the house, where he showed us boys what made the front doorbell ring. I at least tried to feel grateful, in parenthesis. But I was only interested in what things meant. My inability to communicate with him on those subjects which most deeply interested each of us was the first indication I had that his world, which I considered by extension the normal world, could never truly be mine. Mother and I understood one another intuitively. Ours was a communication of souls, less so one of speech. Though she never spoke of praying for us children, I know that her prayers and love for me were my greatest blessing during the formative years of my life. Romania was still a feudal land. Its people, gifted artistically, tended otherwise to be somewhat inefficient and unhurried. The country was an anachronism in the busy 20th century. Its workmen could spend 15 years with picks and shovels digging a tunnel under the railway tracks at the main station in the capital. One summer, eager to follow the example of the rest of the modern world, the whole nation, by official mistake, went on daylight losing time. Driver's tests included such penetrating questions as what goes on the front of a car? Headlights, naturally. Years later, Indra Devi, the well-known yoga teacher, told me that while traveling by train through Romania, she had once been asked by the conductor what she was doing in a second-class compartment. Why, can't you see? I have a second-class ticket. Oh, that doesn't matter in Romania. Please just go sit in the first class where everyone else is. Inattention, however, to the petty details of modern commerce and efficiency seemed somehow appropriate in a land that inspired thoughts of music and poetry. Romania was one of the most fascinatingly beautiful countries I have ever seen. A land of fertile plains and soaring mountains, of colorfully clad peasants and musically gifted gypsies, of hay carts on the highways vying with automobiles for the right of way, of giggling naked children, of gay songs and laughter. Frequently outside our colony in the evenings, we would hear bands of gypsies conversing, singing, or playing the violin, the sad, haunting melodies of a people forever outcast from their true home in India. These gypsies were my first contact with the subtly subjective moods of the Orient, moods that, I was to learn, are reflected in many aspects of life in Romania. For centuries, Romania had been under Turkish rule. Now a proud and upcoming Western nation, there still clung to her something of the aura of the mystical East. Romania was a kingdom. King Carol II had his summer home about 60 kilometers, 40 miles, northwest of us in Sinaia, a lovely hill station in the Transylvanian Alps. Though I never saw him there, we too spent many vacations in Sinaia and in other quaint towns and villages nearby, Bușteni, Predeal, Timiș, Brașov. In winter we often skied. In summer we hiked or waded and swam in friendly, chuckling brooks, or played in fragrant meadows. Many times these mountain trips were taken because of my health, which was precarious. I was skinny as a pencil, and forever coming down with a variety of obscure ailments. Timiș was my favorite spot. There we always stayed at a guest lodge run by a German lady, Frau Weidi, whose husband kept bees that produced the best honey I have ever tasted. 60 kilometers to the south of Teliagen was Bucharest, Romania's capital, a clean, modern city that rose like a prophetic dream in the mind of a nation still asleep in the Middle Ages. Ploiești remained, however, the first 9 years of my life, the big city, a not very attractive jumble of dirty streets and uninteresting houses. My recollections of it are few. Visits to Giculescu the grocer, Sunday services at the Anglican Church, and very occasional outings to the movies, Walt Disney cartoons mostly, and comedies featuring Laurel and Hardy, whom the Romanians had renamed fondly Stan and Bran, Stan și Bran. The church served as a focus for Mother's piety. In this area of her life, Dad played the role of disinterested spectator. Though he respected Mother's religious inclinations and went with her to church more or less regularly, I never observed that liturgy held any attraction for him. His own natural concept of reality was more abstract. Nothing, I think, so inspired him as the contemplation of vast eons of geologic time. The thought of a God sitting somewhere on a heavenly throne, bestowing favors on a special group of worshippers, struck him, I suspect, as faintly barbaric. My own natural bent lay somewhere between these two, the pious and the abstract. Like Dad, I was not greatly attracted to the church worship services. The hymns seemed to me rather dull and sad. The minister I considered a good man, but certainly not an inspired or inspiring one. I suppose I accepted the rituals as good things to do. Beyond this pale recognition, however, they held little meaning for me. I wish I could report that the life of Jesus, at least, made a strong impression on me. I am moved by it now. But then it reached me through a barricade of wooden traditionalism, robbed of immediacy. I am sure I couldn't have defined my feelings at the time, but I think what I missed most of all in our church services were love and joy. Mother had these qualities. What impressed and touched me about her was not religion as she defined it, but as she lived it. Like Dad, I found it difficult to believe in a God who loved each human being personally. That God was impersonal seemed to me self-evident when I considered the vastness of the universe. How then, I thought, could he be interested enough to listen to us mortals when we prayed to him? It was only many years later, in the teachings of India, that I found reconciliation of these seemingly incompatible concepts of a God both personal and impersonal. For the infinite Spirit, as my Guru was to explain with perfect simplicity and clarity, though impersonal in its vastness, has become personal also in creating us individual beings. Infinity, in other words, implies infinitesimal smallness as well as infinite immensity. Though I found it difficult to address God personally, I always felt that reality must be spiritual, that it must have some high meaning and purpose. I remember a discussion I had once with Dad. I was about 6 years old at the time. We were standing on the terrace of our Teleagin home, watching the birds twitteringly at play in the large apple tree. In the hundreds of millions of years, Dad said, since the world was created, every species has had its turn at being the master of this planet, except the birds. First there were the fishes, then the insects, then the reptiles, and now man, representing the mammals. Perhaps millions of years from now, man too will be pushed aside, and the birds will get their turn at being the earth's masters. How appealing I found this picture of vast reaches of time. But then a doubt occurred to me. Is there no meaning to it all? Is life nothing but a process of endless variety, with different species ruling for no better reason than that their turn has come? Surely there must be some higher purpose, hidden perhaps, but divine. My questioning mind must have made me something of a trial to my parents. Mother, on a visit to Italy in 1933, wrote to Miss Hinson, "Please tell the boys that I want them to try to be very good, and that will help both them and me to have a good time. Parenthesis, Donald is sure to find a flaw in that argument, but you might try it." End parenthesis. Fortunately for me, Mother and Dad never discouraged my questioning. I remember one day at the age of 5 standing in the bathroom watching Dad shave. I was pondering one of the deep mysteries of childhood. How can Santa Claus reach every home on earth in a single night? Suddenly the answer dawned on me. Daddy, there isn't really a Santa Claus, is there? Dad, too honest to insist that there is, but too considerate of the sweet myths of childhood to admit that there isn't, hedged his reply. I understood him perfectly. Then and there I decided that it would be really much more fun to go on believing in Santa Claus anyway. In that spirit, I believe in him still. Myths are an important part of life. Paradoxical as it seems, they are important to man's search for truth as well. For they help to give his mind the elasticity it needs to imagine new solutions to old problems. Myths, in fact, formed a large part of my education. I loved Greek mythology, the adventures of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, the legends of Robin Hood and Peter Pan, Grimm's fairy tales, stories from the Old Testament, myths all in which goodness, courage, and honor win in the end. One's life experiences may not always endorse these moral preachments, but wise men and women have ever insisted that justice does prevail eventually, even if the time of reckoning stretches to distant horizons. Yolto dharma toto joya, proclaim the Indian scriptures. Where there is righteousness, there is victory. Fact may well, as people claim, be stranger than fiction, but fiction is very often, in a deeper sense, truer than fact. I think it a pity that the ancient myths are not given more emphasis in modern education. Certainly they enriched my own upbringing. But then the culture of Romania was more conducive to legend-telling than that of pragmatic America. As children, my brothers and I got periodic opportunities to compare these two countries. Every 3 or 4 years, Dad received a 3-month vacation, all expenses paid, in America. My first journey was when I was 6 months old, then 3, 7, 10, and 13. It was after I turned 13 that we settled here. I still remember my amazement at the age of 3 on arriving in London to find waiters, taxi drivers, the man in the street, all speaking English. I'd supposed English was spoken only by parents and their friends. Nurses, of course, spoke German. But wasn't it a law of life that practically everyone else spoke Romanian? I suppose by so compartmentalizing these languages, I managed to keep from confusing them. A further example, perhaps, of the value of the myth-making process. Once Mother addressed me in Romanian. I replied to her in shocked tones, "Mother, don't talk to me like that." Looking at America with a mentality that was partly Romanian, I received insights that sometimes conflicted with my pride in being an American. I deeply loved America. I admired its dynamic energy and stood almost in awe of its constant emphasis on common sense. The Americans I met seemed to know exactly what to do in every situation. I loved them, too, for their kindness whenever they took the time from constant driving activity to be kind. But on the other hand, I found myself puzzled by what often struck me in our conversation as big talk. I'd noticed it in a few of the Americans in Teliagen, especially in the newcomers. In America, even the children, it seemed, were always trying to show how grown up they were, how sophisticated, how important. It was as though they had no patience with childhood. What, I wondered, was all that important about being important? Compared to America, Romania is a little country. Though independent in spirit, its people have a less exalted self-image. Americans with their 4 million territorial square miles, parenthesis, the U.S. is the third largest country in the world after Russia and Canada, in parenthesis, fall more easily into the thought of self-importance, a temptation which seems to accompany bigness, whether in nations, institutions, or individuals. Vacations in America entailed visits to our various relatives. My earliest memories include Mother Ella, my maternal grandmother, who died while I was still young. I remember best her sweet smile, so loving it seemed almost saintly. My paternal grandparents, who lived longer, were simple, good people also. It was in these relatives, and in many other people like them, that I caught my first glimpse of the special spiritual genius of America. Childlike innocence and simplicity, a predisposition to see goodness in others, a love of freedom tempered by a desire to live in harmony with man and God. Granddad introduced me also to another American trait, the tendency to dignify inconsequential matters humorously by pretending that more serious issues were at stake. It is a trait that can, and sometimes does, lead to misunderstandings. Once in Tulsa, Dad paid a minor traffic fine. Granddad remarked to me afterwards, straight-facedly, "Well, I guess your dad escaped prison this time." I took him literally. Several days later, we were eating in a crowded restaurant. As sometimes happens in a crowd, there occurred a brief interlude when, for no apparent reason, everyone in the room stopped talking. Everyone, that is, but young Donald. "Daddy," I cried in a loud voice, "tell us about the time you escaped from prison." Momentarily, the room was silent in shock. Then suddenly everyone was laughing. Why, I wondered, was Dad blushing so furiously? Trips to and from America must have been something of an ordeal for our poor parents. We were 3 brothers. Dick, the youngest, wasn't old enough to engage in much fraternal rivalry, but Bob and I were close to the same age, and when we weren't cooperating in some misadventure, like the time we upset a traveling prince and his retinue by scrambling their shoes, left overnight in the corridor to be shined, we often wrestled each other to work off excess energy. Bob was born 1.5 years after me, but soon he grew to my height and occasionally surpassed it. He felt little hesitancy in challenging a seniority which I had no intention of relinquishing. Temperamental differences existed between us, too. Bob was impulsive, outgoing, fond of popularity, demonstrative of his feelings. I was in many ways quite the opposite, reserved, pensive, forever questioning. Bob once picked up a caterpillar from a path, with the loving cry, "There, there, you poor little worm. I'll put you over here so no one can step on you." He then ran off gaily, quite forgetting the incident. Had I helped the same caterpillar, I would have pondered the incident for days, wondering what it was that made certain creatures defenseless, and why this particular insect out of millions should have received help. Beside Bob, I'm afraid I sometimes felt myself rather a lump. As a matter of fact, that thought sometimes seemed to bother him, too. His spirit of rivalry was, I think, rooted partly in unconscious disapproval of me for not being more like others. But for all that, we managed to be good friends. And always, where the rest of the world was concerned, we stood together in brotherly solidarity, never more so than when either of us was being threatened. Fighting is, I suppose, inextricably a part of the process of growing up, particularly so for boys. I recall what might be considered my fair share of boyhood scraps, though I don't remember ever instigating one. Parenthesis, in this respect, I was unlike my cousin Ed, who made full aggressive use of nature's gift to him of a strong body. "Eddie," his mother once admonished him, "don't you know that when another boy hits you, you shouldn't hit back?" "Oh, but mother," Ed remonstrated self-righteously, "I never hit back. I always hit first." End parenthesis. Though I myself never hit first, if ever it seemed important to me to demonstrate to others or to myself that I was no coward, I was not one to turn the other cheek. Several fights, in fact, far from stirring me now to repentance, stand out in memory as having helped me to learn worthwhile lessons. It was because of a fight that I first learned something of the fickleness of human loyalties. I was 7 or 8 at the time. Alvin, a big boy who was visiting Teleogen with his parents, determined to impose his command on our group. Braun, fortunately, was not important to our group dynamics. I knew that the support I had from my friends was born of mutual affection, not of fear. But when Alvin challenged me, his victory seemed so much a foregone conclusion that most of the children, fearing later retribution, sided with him. Bob was the sole exception. I was indignant at the rest of them for their fickleness, and determined to teach them a good lesson by beating Alvin. It was a long, somewhat bloody battle. Every shot for Alvin only goaded me to renewed efforts. Gradually his strength flagged. As it began to look as if I might win after all, first one of the children, then another, joined Bob in rooting for me. At last Alvin's courage crumbled altogether. By this time everyone was enthusiastically on my side. Victory was bittersweet for me that day, however. I knew my friends had really wanted me to win all along, but I also understood a little bit of what an unreliable thing is the support of one's fellow creatures. Wise indeed is he who discovered that God's friendship alone can never fail him. Disappointment, however, is a good teacher. It helps us to take our first faltering steps out of childhood toward maturity. For the world is frequently at odds with our desires. The sign of maturity is a willingness to adjust to realities broader than one's own. It is how we react to disappointment that determines whether our development will be a shrinking inward towards bitterness and cynicism, or an expansion outward towards acceptance and wisdom.
So, here we go. Right, the first sentence. He says, "Joy has always been my first love. I have longed to share it with others." All his life, Swamiji, when he was sharing Master's teachings, he always used to say that, when whatever I would get, I would always think, how can I share it? So he was always that expansive, and right, even as a little boy, he always had the same thing. He says, joy is very different, right? This is not a typical boy. Joy has always been my first love. I have longed to share it with others. So never, holding it for himself. So now here, the next para where he says, a lingering impression is one of wonder to be in this world at all. What was I doing here? He's questioning. We are talking about a 5-year-old boy who's questioning, why am I here? What am I doing here? And he always felt that there is a world much beautiful than this. Being on this earthly planes represents mere exile. It seems like he felt this is not where I belong, right? So he's almost like talking about the astral world, a world perhaps radiant, beautiful, harmonious, in relation to which this earthly plane represented mere exile. Beautiful sounds and colors thrilled me almost to ecstasy. Reminds of Ramakrishna Parahamsa, when he was a little young boy, and he was like passing through a field, and he saw a group of crane flying overhead, and he went into ecstasy. That was his first samadhi in that body as Ramakrishna. So Swamiji also tells about that beautiful sounds and colors thrilled him almost to ecstasy. Master also tells us that astral world is much more beautiful. Like if we see beautiful vistas on the earth, the colors on the earth, then it is actually a mere reflection of, and not really a full reflection of what the astral colors are all about. Astral sounds, they are much more radiant, much more brilliant colors. The rainbows that he's talking about, like he would create the blanket, he'll put that and sit underneath. Master said that in astral world, the lights would be like that. The rain would be, it's not water that is dropping, it's like the colorful light that falls down as rain. And people who are who have earned their right to be awake in the astral world can create. If I feel like, oh, this rain should look blue color or red color, they can create it the way they want it. So it's a beautiful world. And Swamiji perhaps even as a child, he had not left behind his stay in the astral world, so he was still very reminiscent of that world. So, and he's saying that I would imagine myself living in a world of rainbow colored lights. That's why probably in this lifetime he went on to create Ananda village. If you look at the pictures, especially during the tulip time and all, it looks like we have stepped into an astral world. It doesn't seem part of this regular earthly life. So I think that's the reason he created that beauty on earth. I would see myself absorbed in the radiant inner light. Again, this is, he says, my consciousness would expand beyond the limits of my body. So it wasn't a normal childhood. It wasn't like only after he met Master that it all changed and through his efforts. So he was born different, right? And even as a child, he didn't know what was happening probably, because nobody in America or Romania where he was living understood it. That's why nobody could relate to what Donald was as a child. But he had these experiences where probably he got an understanding of what he had been having these experiences once he met Master, and that's when it all started getting clear for him. And Mother says that you were eager for knowledge but keenly sympathetic to the misfortune. So very compassionate as a child, very expansive, joyful person as a child also. He says, my inner joy spilled over into an intense enthusiasm for life. So this is all very yogic, right? What he is talking about. Though at that time he didn't know what this is all about. And he generally, what he goes on to explain is a happy childhood. Normally they say that you come onto the spiritual world when there's a lot of suffering, but it doesn't seem like that. This is like he was already seeking. Even as a child he was seeking. Probably he's brought it from his previous lifetimes. So It was a happy childhood. He says leadership came naturally to me, but he was always very different. He says that to children in the where they grew up, he says did did share them what his his interests were, and enthusiastically embraced my ideas more and more. However, as I grew older, I discovered that many people considered my view of things somewhat peculiar, and he also felt what these children were what seemed important to him were not so important to others, and what they considered important, he says, I didn't understand that. So and that's why he thought that probably, and he says from a certain inability, he had an inability to attune to what seems the trend, the normal trend of people around him. And as the lady who their governess also writes, Dawn, you were certainly different, Dawn, in the family, but not of it. Krishna in Bhagavad Gita says that, be in this world, but not of this world. So, Swami Kriyananda was already displaying those tendencies without being very conscious of it, but it was naturally for him. So this is very, very kind of a detachment. Though he was very enjoying himself, he was very happy. It was a nice childhood. The parents were very good. He had a typical, childhood with his brothers and playing with them, fighting with his brother, the one right next to him. But yet, there was always a kind of non-attached to what was happening around him. He says, I was always conscious that she writes that you had a mystic quality which set you apart. Others were aware too. Parents also realized this is a different child, right? People around him, the neighbors, they also noticed it. And as she says that those blue-gray eyes, the straight look from your blue-gray almost makes you ageless. That's like, it's an old soul. And in a quite disconcerting way, you made little funny experiments on other people to satisfy your suspicions about something concerning them. So it was he didn't really belong there with everyone. He always wanted the truth behind everything. These were indications of what Swami Kriyananda finally, is what we know him as. It was something that was already there. The roots, the seeds were already there in his childhood itself, right? And he wouldn't let somebody makes some false claim, he just goes after them. And he says, I wanted miracles to belong in the real of the possible. That is why he went out. He thought there's some miracle. But this is again a very important thing. He thought that why can't miracles be part of this realm that we are living in? Which later on, that is what probably in Autobiography of a Yogi, where Swamiji writes that, eighth page. So he grew up in a very American culture. Eighth page, he says, I when I was reading Autobiography of a Yogi, and suddenly in the field, Lahiri Mahasaya manifests and tells Paramahamsa Yogananda's father, Bhagavati, you are being very, tough with your employee, and then he disappears. He says, when I read that, I couldn't understand. How can this happen? He says, but I felt that what this person has written, instinctively, he had faith. So if he has written, it must be true. So he said, there were a lot of things in that book that I kept keeping on a shelf to go back later. Abhi to nahi samajh mein aa raha types, but he did, as a kid also, felt that he wanted miracles to belong to this realm. And again, the neighbor says that, I am always nice to Don because he's not like the others. I believe he knows this and is lonely. Where the Swamiji also writes in the first chapter that he said, I'm very grateful to my parents for taking in a stranger amidst them. So he is very aware that it's a beautiful family that has taken in him, because he needed this environment probably for growing up. But he knows that they are not his people, right? His is what he felt, the belonging once he came to master. Master's spiritual family is when he felt that, I have come home. So he always says, no, that a certain sense of being alone was always there. Okay, so the parents were like, very nice parents. They were very loving to each other. They were loving to the kids. And the growing up was always, again, he says that my father, he was a scientist, he was a geologist, right? So he was attracted to the house of thing, whereas I was attracted to wise. He says, because I instinctively was a mystic and philosopher. So he was different, and he didn't belong to the typical boys, what his father would have expected. He knew that he wasn't that, and father also knew that. And mother was more religious, and he says that I connected with her intuitively. So here, in this, the last line, where he talks about the gypsies, he says, we would hear bands of gypsies conversing, singing, or playing the violin, the sad, haunting melodies of a people forever outcast from their true home in India. So these gypsies in Romania are basically Indians, okay, who mostly from Rajasthan and Punjab region, who started migrating or kind of moving away because of all the invasions that we're having from the Western Asia. So to avoid that, a large group of people moved away and started traveling that side. And each places they went to, a lot of them settled down and keep moving. But these people, the gypsies who finally reached the Europe, also in Romania, they have been there for centuries now, but they look different, right? They have a very Indian look. So they are never accepted wherever they went. They were all Hindus who later on, went on to take on the religions of the regions they settled in or moved around in. But they were never completely accepted in these countries they live. So there is always this feeling of not belonging that they have, right? He says, these gypsies were my first contact with the subtly subjective moods of the Orient. That's where he had this first, though he not very consciously he was seeking or anything at that time. And now here, where he talks about the church, where the mother used to go, father was very disinterested because he didn't really understand, how a god sitting somewhere on a heavenly throne, bestowing favors on special groups of worshippers. He says he felt it faintly barbaric. I think probably this is the reason, many people in the Christian tradition were became atheist, because this is something very what the bishop says all that is right, their interpretation, and God is some he's like this one man with white robe and a beard and sitting in some far off region, and giving punishments is something not many people are able to accept it. And so it was kind of dry, religion was very dry. This a beautiful thing, he says, even I couldn't relate to that, though he used to go. But what he says that now I am very moved by the life of Jesus, because Jesus came alive for him after he met Yogananda, and the way Yogananda explained what Jesus is, or Jesus' teachings are. Till then it was very dry, he didn't understand. He says, but then it reached me through a barricade of wooden traditionalism, robbed of immediacy. I'm sure I couldn't have defined my feelings at the time. This is very important. He says, I think what I missed most of all in our church services were love and joy. He says, mother had these qualities. What impressed and touched me about her was not religion as she defined it, but as she lived it. I think it was Lahiri Mahashaya who said, your religion is tested the cold light of day. So that is what it is. We can say, oh, God is this, or master said this, or master said that, quotes after quotes from various texts. But how do we conduct ourselves during the day? That is what defines what what is our definition of religion, right? So that's what he's saying. His mother, she was she was all about love. She was all about joy. She lived it. The attitude that she lived her life, that defined religion for him when he was growing up, which is what has to be also. I mean, later on, of course, our masters also said the same thing. So that how you live, the attitudes with which you live is what defines our spirituality, not what we say, the big quotes that we can talk about. So he says, I found it difficult like that to believe in a God who loved each human being personally. So, and but he says later on, when he came to read about the teachings of India, that I found reconciliation of these seemingly incompatible concepts of a God, both personal and impersonal. Very interesting that today only we just, every week Nayaswami, Devi, and Jyotish send write blogs, right? And we receive the mail. So, interestingly, today the blog that I received from Devi was on this, that God is both impersonal because He is the infinite who created everything, right? So He is impersonal in His love. Everything is his creation, so He loves everyone, but yet he relates to us individually also, according to our nature. So that is his personal love to us, right? um, so God created everything out of his consciousness and became it. So each one of us is an expression of God. So he loves us personally and impersonally. So once this gets over, I'll share that blog in the group for all to read. It's a beautiful blog. Please do read it. So she says, for the infinite spirit, as my guru was to explain with perfect simplicity and clarity, um, though impersonal in its vastness, has become personal also in creating each of us individual beings. Infinity, in other words, implies infinitesimal small as well as infinite immensity. So every atom is is an expression of God. So God is this vastness, yet He is in every cell, every atom, everything that pervades this universe, right? Though I found it difficult to address God personally, he says, I always felt that reality must be. It's a 6-year-old boy. He's saying this. I always felt that reality must be spiritual, that it must be some high meaning and purpose. And then he says that the father said that, only the birds have not been the kings of the planet till now. So in some future million years, he says it seemed odd. He says, surely there must be some higher purpose, hidden perhaps, but divine. It can't be a random selection कि चलो ये अभी कुछ साल ये होंगे, कुछ साल something else. He says it can't be. Now here it is a 6-year-old boy who's thinking like it's not possible. There has to be a more deeper meaning than this random selection of species to rule the planet. And now he goes on to say myths, when he's talking about myths about Santa Claus, that episode is there in the movie The Answer, where he asks his father, is Santa Claus real? So he says myths are an important part of life. Paradoxical as it seems, they are important to man's search for truth, for they help his mind to become elastic to there's new solutions to old problems. And even in India we have these Amar Chitra Katha we used to have, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita. There's so many books, Panchatantra. All of these have nice small stories for people, normal people, for children, with moral stories, with these are important part of growing up. I hope the kids are still reading these things as they grow up. These are very important in shaping our idea of the world, understanding more in very simple way, story ways. I think it is a pity that the ancient myths are not given more emphasis in modern education. Certainly, he says, they enriched my own upbringing. So then he is talking about Americans, and even as a child, he says, um, he tuned into what, I mean, he was living most of that period of time, he was living in Romania and would just visit it. But went beyond it, right? He didn't just relate to people on a very superficial. He says, I received insights that sometimes conflicted with my pride in being an American. So he was able to go beyond what was superficial and understand that it was as though people had this very important feeling. And he says, what was that important about being important? Again, a little child thinking on these terms. Okay, here is where he talks about, that America has a spiritual genius. So what the time he was growing up is the time, around that time Master came to America. Because of these reasons, right? West was ready to receive these ancient teachings of Kriya Yoga. Because of these things, where Swamiji says, I caught my first glimpse of special spiritual genius of America, childlike innocence, simplicity, a predisposition to see goodness in others, a love of freedom tempered by a desire to live in harmony with man and God. Even their constitution, I don't know what they call it, it also has that, liberty, freedom, all that is ingrained in there. And America was ready to receive these deep spiritual teachings during this time. Okay, and almost the last now. And he talks about here, where he talks about, the bullies being hit by other boys. Master also had, when he was growing up and he was 12 or 13 years old, in the book called Mukunda, it talks about, when he was also a very wiry, thin boy. But when he would never, he says that, Swamiji himself, he says that I never would hit first, but again, he would not show the next cheek just because somebody is hitting. So if it was wrong, he would give back also. Master also did that. When there was a school bully, he hit him back big time. Though he was a thin boy and that was a huge boy, but he didn't take it. And Swamiji displayed similar tendency, where he used his willpower. The boy was big and the others were cheering for him, and the more they were cheering for him, he said, I would teach him a lesson too, his friends. So he used his willpower and finally he won over him. And here he talks about a very important lesson. He says that I understood a little bit of what an unreliable thing is the support of one's fellow creatures. He who discovers that God's friendship alone can never fail him. God, Guru are our true friends. They are not, swayed by outward whatever is happening. These friends were like, because they felt that the other boy is huge, so he is anyway, going to win. So they are rooting for him because otherwise he'll come and hit me later. So it is always self-interest and not so much of, Don is my friend, I have to support him. Only when Don started to win is when they started supporting him. So this was an important lesson he learned as a little boy. He says, it's unreliable. Disappointment is a very good teacher. As a child, he was disappointed in the friends he was playing with, but he says it's a very good teacher. It helps us to take our first faltering steps out of childhood towards maturity. For the world is frequently at odds with our desires. The sign of maturity is a willingness to adjust to realities broader than one's own. Being flexible, acceptance. That's a huge spiritual lesson, right? Accept things as they are. No, don't wish it otherwise. It is how it is. Our life, our circumstances, the environment around us, it is as it is. So first thing is accept. Center yourself, accept this is how it is. And then be flexible. The more you resist it, more it will hit us. And we will fall down. Right? If the roots are deep, we are centered, we accept it. And then, gently sway with it. How the wind is flowing, the more we are flexible, the more it will just pass by. So that is what he's saying. The sign of maturity is a willingness to adjust to realities broader than one's own. It is how we react to disappointment that determines whether our development will be a shrinking inward, closing down against the world, being bitter and cynicism, ऐसे ही हैं लोग, ऐसे ही हैं, people are like this, they will always or you expand, you accept, yeah, this is how it is. Expand into expansion outward towards acceptance and wisdom. This is how it is. So what do I do? What's the solution? God. Find God. God, Guru is our own. They will never judge us, they will never ditch us. So so that is where we need to be headed. So this is a very important lesson in this chapter, I think. That first thing is accept things as they are. Next is to be flexible, to be expansive, not hate people, not to judge them, not to be, bitter, but just expand in love, because God is full of love, Guru is full of love, and acceptance and wisdom. When wisdom comes, anyways, it is, we understand it better. That only God, that's the only solution to everything. So, any thoughts, or should we end today's session? Okay. Okay. Thank you for joining. We will meet next week with further next chapter, more insights, and I will share that blog by Deviji, which talks about being personal and impersonal both. So thank you.
Thank you.